So this morning's Dharma talk is based on the third of the four chants we do every morning here at SokukoJi Buddhist Temple Monastery, called Sandokai, the equality of sameness and difference. The equality of sameness and difference. And the line is, I think it's third from the bottom, reading the words you should grasp the great reality. Do not judge by any standards. Do not judge by any standards. That's difficult because we need rules, we need guidelines, we need standards, we need them. But the idea of taking, what happens is our self-centeredness, our ego, we tend to get a little worried about too much open space, too much not being sure what's going on, and we tend to lock down on something sometimes called fundamentalism, and we just lock down out of not wanting to be fearful, not willing to have the kind of openness or the kind of receptivity that it takes to actually see the ultimate truth, to actually awaken to what the Buddha taught 2,500 years ago. So don't judge by any standards. What it's saying is basically don't set up your own interpretation of the rules. If you come to this monastery, look at the rules, follow them. Obviously, if you're doing this in the way it's taught here, you will follow the rules, and then there may be times when you can't really comply with something. You may be ill, something else may come up. So it's a very it's a very soft boundary. The boundary is very gentle. It is meant to help you with your practice. But for instance, one of the things that will happen is if you're coming in here every day, and I hear this not only from others, but I've experienced this myself, coming in here and the Hanan bell happens at 6:45 in the morning, and then there's 2 hours of sitting from 7 till 9. You hear the Hanan bell, you follow it, you come in, you come down here, you come in and sit, and then someone else who's been sitting right along, suddenly they get up and leave. Or you notice that they don't stay the full period. And so right away we go into some kind of right and wrong mentality about that. There's no way you can know all the causes and conditions that lead to anybody's motion this way or that way. It's so completely deep that our whole society is based on right and wrong, and the right and wrong is based on, quite often, on somebody's judgment of what you're doing by setting up a standard. And so the idea is not to have, it's not that you shouldn't have some guidelines and have rules, have ethics, and so on, have a morality and so on. Someone asked me once, I think someone asked me if I had a moral compass. Was that it? Moral compass. And so, and I don't remember what my response was, but basically there's a way of working with the world that if you can work with it out of awareness, you can actually pay attention to or observe the concept or the guideline or the form or the precept, however you want to say it, and still not be bound by it. In other words, use it in such a way that you can see there are times when you may go a little bit to this side, at times you may go a little bit to that side. The German philosopher Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote a book, several books. One of them was called Situation Ethics. And he was talking about the ethics that are not just rules, but are situational. So they might modify and change. You have to have a lot of confidence in yourself, and when I say in yourself, in your understanding of what this world is about, in order to function that way. Because you're not going to get good press from those around you, probably. Those people who are struggling with fighting with their mind, those who have these little kind of warfare in their mind, are going to do what? Project that warfare out on you. We've all experienced this. You're doing fine, you talk to someone, and suddenly you have somebody who's very mad at you for something that is practically happening in their mind alone. And, they're projecting their warfare, their difficulty, their right and wrong mentality, because to have it inside is so painful. And so, especially without a spiritual path, we tend to project that out on someone else and blame someone, or blame a situation, or blame our parents, or blame something that happened to us. Rather, it's not that this is the part that's difficult. It's not that the relative truth of that isn't applicable. It doesn't mean that someone didn't do something to you, to harm you. It just means that if you go that direction, you'll continue to go back right and wrong, correct and incorrect, correct and incorrect. And it's circular. It's called, and the Buddhist Sanskrit word for this is samsara, or the constant wheel of this and then that, and then this, and then that's very circular. Life and death, right and wrong, success and failure, health and sickness. We all go through that, and it's just called a cycle. There's cycles everywhere. So don't set up standards. The idea is not to lock down on it. The one that in Branching Streams Flow Through the Darkness, a book that SokukoJi, a compilation of his talks on Sandokai, or the equality of sameness and difference, which, as like I said, we chant every morning, third chant. Wrote a book entitled that, and he one of the images that he used that I like very much is like the Zen image that all of us have probably heard of. This is the finger pointing at the moon. If you're looking at the finger, you can see what the finger is talking about, but if you look at it, then you can't see the finger, you just see the moon. So then that's risky for ego, so it wants to go back to the finger. Well, that wanting to go back to the finger, wanting to go back to the instruction, wanting to go back to what the information, as it says here, reading the words, you should grasp the great reality. So seeing the finger where it's pointing, you should grasp. In other words, you should understand what is being pointed at is ineffable. It is transcendent. And so, but we don't trust. We because we're so used to having confidence based on success and failure and on relative truth. That's just too much space for us. So this is why the practice of meditation is so powerful. Sitting down, holding still, strengthening that which sees. It's completely lonely. The more alone you feel, the more bored you feel, the more even exhausted you might feel. Probably doing this correctly. Because ego will come up with all kinds of shenanigans about why you shouldn't sit here. Well, this isn't working for me. Well, this doesn't feel good. Well, I don't know. This is why it seems to be necessary to have a teaching person, in which I'm fulfilling that position right now, and have a place to study, a wall, and the sutras, or what we're talking about here, a Dharma talk, excuse me, and a Sangha, or a community of people. In Buddhism, there's the three jewels, the Buddha, the example of someone who understood this, understood reality, the example of someone who was sane, the Buddha, the Dharma, or the truth that he or she taught, depends on the overall situation, and the Sangha, or the community of people who are all endeavoring to understand what this guy 2,500 years ago said. Everything is dependently arisen. There's not a separate self anywhere. So if you think, anytime you have feelings, emotions, ideas, that what happens is we tend to go to a self that's having those. We're not saying there aren't feelings. We're not saying there aren't ideas. We're not saying there isn't fear, there isn't suffering. There is. There's a tremendous amount of it, but there's no one actually owns that or has that. in the Yogacara tradition, of which Chan and Zen teaching comes out of and is founded on, the Samdhi Nirmochana Sutra, the Lankavatara Sutra, and the teachings of Vasubandhu, right back to the Buddha himself, are basically saying that everything is perception only. So everything is just a perception. Just the perception. You see the teachings, and it says here, reading the words, you should grasp the great reality. Do not judge by any standards. So if you see someone doing it differently, if you see another lineage, this is one of the things that Shunryu Suzuki Roshi was using as an example. He was saying the Rinzai, the Soto, or the northern school or the southern school, you see someone else doing it differently, same moon. It's just a different way of, I know Shara, a student of mine who's living in Taiwan, I got a text from her that one of her friends, I don't think she'll mind me saying something about it, one of her friends took her to another kind of temple where it was kind of, I can't really go into what the text said, but pretty fancy and lots of different things that she hadn't run into. She thought it was interesting, but not really her My words, not hers, not her cup of tea. It was just, interesting, and she went. So this doesn't mean that some people don't need that particular way. It's just like the spiritual path is just, there's indigenous Americans, there's shamanism, there's Catholicism, there's all the 4 main lineages of the Tibetan path, the Kagyu, the Nyingma, the Sakya, the Gelugpa, and then all of the sub-schools, the 4 great and the 8 lesser schools in the Kagyu. It just goes on and on, and because there's all these different teachers, and they all say, well, I'm going to teach it this way, well, I'm going to teach it that way. I'm not saying they say that, but there's different ways of pointing at that, and each one is just as valid. There's lots of ways, a mountain has one peak, but there's all kinds of roads going to the top of it. Just another image or metaphor for awakening, going to the top of the mountain. If you want to go to the top of the mountain, you need to talk to somebody who goes up and down that mountain all the time. Or not, or find your own way. But quite often what you'll do is go around the mountain. It's called samsara. Excuse my clearing my throat. So reading the words, you should grasp the great reality. Do not judge by any standards. If you do not see the way, you do not see it, even as you walk on it. When you walk the way, it is not near, it is not far. If you are deluded, you are mountains and rivers away from it. I respectfully say to those who wish to be enlightened, do not waste your time by night or day. That's the end of Sandokai, written by Sekito Kisen, one of our lineage holders in the Soto lineage, in the 8th century. He was born in 700 and lived to be 90 years old. So he pretty much wiped out that whole century with his commentary. We have questions at this point? Michael?
Why is it so important not to judge?
Because as soon as you judge, this is what it looks like. This is just an image. As soon as you say right or wrong, good or bad, or awakened or deluded, or anything about yourself or about anything, all investigation stops. Because now you're actually working on a concept. You're actually sealing up the very thing that you set out to explore. And it gets more and more difficult for ego or self-centeredness as we get closer and closer to the edge of the cliff, where ego is going to try to witness its own death. It gets more and more challenging. As we approach that, it gets more and more scary. And that's why it seems to be necessary to have a teacher to badger you. Yes, sir.
What is the difference between an opinion and a judgment?
Both of them are pretty useless to start with. This is an opinion, and this is a judgment. So anytime you judge, I'm not saying that if you're sitting looking at something that there isn't some kind of a immediate and precise evaluation of something based on the situation, based on the causes and conditions that are constantly changing. But as soon as you come up with an idea, you laminate something, this is what this means and this is what should be done, then the world keeps changing behind your opinion, your judgment. This is very difficult because we want to lock things down. We want, and in some situations, in order to get anything accomplished along the relative lines, you have to lock things down. There's like in a monastery, there's very definite rules. You've got a bunch of 18-year-old kids come to the monastery. You're not going to say, well, if you're sick, you can stay in your room. Not going to work. You need to get down here and practice. The same way in the military, which Eric and I were both. I don't know if anybody else is in the military here. But that's not something it doesn't work in that area because of the nature of that situation, because there is an agreed upon reality. When you join the military, you're agreeing on that particular way of working with the world. You follow orders. This is the order. You don't question it. You don't have to. You don't get to do that. Not easy to live that way. But then some people, that's how they live, and there's no right or wrong to that. Opinions and judgments, the opinion it might be more a little bit more passive, and the judgment might be more active. So, but anytime anybody judges anything, it's all evidence is partial. There's no way you can see all the causes and conditions that provide us with any given situation. It's like the name of Suzuki Roshi's book is Branching Streams Flow in the Darkness. And see if I can find that line here. Probably can't. I don't know, can you find it? And the idea is that the causes and conditions that provide us with any given, say, result, like a human being is a result, are so vast and varied.
The subtle sources.
Yeah. The subtle source is clear and bright. This is the Buddha nature. The source of reality is clear and bright. The tributary streams flow through the darkness. So all of the things that come to make that up, it works both directions. So there's no way you can say, look in the mirror and look at the shape of your nostrils or something and find out why they're that way. Why are they that way? You could say, well, I think I got those from my mother. Sometimes we'll say, where did you get your fat head from? Why, that was my dad. He's got a fat head. So we tend to go in and kind of settle for some kind of a relative statement about it. But there's no way you can find. Everyone is completely unique and at the same time without a self. It's astonishing. It's confusing because we realize how unique our personality is relative to all the people we know and meet. We realize how it's just amazing. We're so different than everyone, and we use that kind of that difference as a credential. But practice of meditation takes you into it's also the same. It's also just everyone. No one is separate from the awakened one or the Buddha. So he awoke to that. Further questions? Yes, Michael.
Could you talk about the link between judgment and the self?
How do you mean, the ego? So judgment is just wanting to reify or validate something so that the self-centeredness is no longer threatened, so that you no longer have that feeling as I don't know what's going on. I mean, you could take it right to a courtroom and say, well, now we know that person is guilty. They did this and this and this. But the way the whole thing is set up is as if you could actually find the ultimate cause of anything. You can't. It's dependent. Everything is dependently arisen. Everything you see that looks like an individual, including your own image in a mirror, that looks like a solid separate thing, is dependently arisen. And the astonishing miracle of this is that there is an actual intelligence that arises in this organism we call a human being. Sometimes it arises so powerfully in a dog that we actually think that they're thinking about stuff like people, because there's something about them that it's like I often have said, if the Jack Russells that I used to own had human vocal cords, they'd be ordering you around, telling you, time to do this, don't buy that kind of food anymore. Sucks. I've been telling you, bark, bark, bark. Been telling you over and over. They think they're communicating. How do I know? I don't know. I'm just making stuff up. I have no idea. You don't need a position. If you understand who this is, if you understand who you are, fundamentally, I mean, way down, if you understand, you don't need an opinion. You don't need a judgment. We might see them all over the place, people trying to get some kind of reference point so they know, is it good or is it bad? How many times have you had a conversation with someone and you hear them say, was that good or bad? And I said, I'll show you bad. I'll punch you in the nose. I mean, I'm not going to punch anybody, but it's that kind of a thing. It's like when somebody says that, there's so much confusion on there that if they're starting to use that kind of language, then it's very difficult to worm your way down into the source or the tributary streams flowing through the darkness to the source of that kind of illusion. So the only thing you can do is encourage them if you're a meditator. If you're not, then that's fine. Your karma is your own. I won't interfere with anyone if I can help it. More?
Three-part question from Sheldon, who's listening in from Teconcho.
Where were you, Sheldon? We had trouble with that camera. You weren't here. And I'm not judging you.
His first question,
Yes,
I'll read all three and then I can reread.
certainly.
When are we not setting up standards? Aren't we constantly judging everything that arises? How can we even not set up standards?
Okay, so the injunction, the teaching to don't set up standards, the person who's teaching that, I can't speak for Suzuki Roshi or for Sekito Kisen, but I was speaking, my way of understanding that, of course you can't help but do that. But the way you bring awareness to that is you say, don't set up standards. And then when you go and you see, I can't help it. But look how much awareness you're starting to flood that whole dynamic, that whole kind of warfare dynamic of who's the enemy, who's our friends, who's our enemies, and who's right, who's wrong. You're flooding that with awareness. And so you can't help but do that. But if there's a lot of awareness around that, when I say don't set up standards, I know you can't help but do that. Yes.
His next question, aren't we constantly judging everything that arises?
But that's awareness. Oh, he's in there? Sheldon, are you in there? I doubt it. I doubt that he's in there. So that as soon as you set up standards, it goes like this. But if you see that you set up standards, then this may come up, but there's a lot of space around that. You actually understand that image. You actually can feel yourself pushing on something. And what you'll notice is you probably won't do anything else about it. You won't go to war with that. If you feel like someone has done this or that that's kind of rubbing you the wrong way, and you feel your ire or your aggression start to arise, you won't go to war with your own aggression. Big mistake to do that. When I say big mistake, that's a judgment, but it's also an observation. I'm just saying that we just tend to tumble around more. It seems to work better to just allow as much space as you can for that negativity to do whatever it needs to do. It'll eventually burn itself out. All negativity is fueled by suffering, by aggression, by hatred in some cases. More. Last part of the question.
Was how can we even not set up standards?
So there again, but if you bring a lot of awareness to that, then that whole structure, because you're looking at it, you're looking at the standard you're setting up, it starts to get weaker, and it might not collapse totally. What really needs to collapse, and this is another way of addressing the same question, is the sense of someone who sets up standards. The reality of someone who is a standard setter-upper, does that work? Someone who's actually doing that. It's the identity. That's why we're doing it, is to reinforce and secure the identity of me, and I know that's wrong, or me and I know that's incorrect, or they shouldn't be doing that, and so on. So what happens is you'll set up standards until you finally see that the very basic misunderstanding of mistaken identity. You think when I say you, I'm saying this is how the dynamic seems to work. We think we are somebody. And if you think you are somebody, you will just knee-jerk set up standards. But if you sit and practice and bring a lot of awareness to that, you'll see the standards being set up, and then eventually you'll trace it back, and you'll see that there's an identity there called me. It's in the Yogacara tradition, it's people who have analyzed this deeply, so we don't have to do it. But the seventh consciousness, or the klesha mind, is there with an attitude of me and my stuff. I've got to protect this, and it's a total. It's just a big bundle of paranoia about being threatened. And so, if you see that, then the image of the self, the separation of the self, it starts to be seen to be unreal. You don't have to get rid of something that's unreal. You don't have to get rid of your ego. If you see that it's unreal, then it may hang around, it may not. Yes?
So you've gone to war with someone. They've hurt your feelings, you've hurt their feelings.
Yeah.
Is an apology
I'm listening.
necessary, or is it just a judgment?
So it's multiple choice, I get those two choices? Okay. Which one would you like me to pick? Let me say it this way, I'll address that. It's dependently arisen. That's why we don't want to set up standards, because one person you may apologize to, and the next person you may not, and you may not even be sure why. But if you're operating out of awareness, you will not have the reference points that give you the security of a self who's right because they apologized, or gives you the situation of not being able to handle not apologizing, because then you feel like there's an identity that's wrong. I should have apologized. I should have apologized. Or I shouldn't have apologized to that ass. You know, all they did was just go through it, walk away. They didn't appreciate my apology. So quite often it's right back to us again. We got to appreciate. If we apologize, somebody has to acknowledge our apology. You know, it's a big three-ring circus of egos dancing around, reinforcing each other. You don't need it. And I'm not saying that if you transcend your ego and become awake, that you won't feel all this negativity. Of course you will. You're still embodied. You're still a human being. You may have seen through the solid self, but there's a whole lot of people around you that haven't, and they're at war. And I just had a person recently that I was doing my very best to help them, and they were not happy with me. I didn't help them enough, and I feel sad that I can't. It hurts me that I can't help them more, but I can't. They have to do it themselves. It's very hard to tell someone who's deeply suffering to go look at the wall. So one person you may apologize to, and another person you may not, for something very similar, but you'll just, if you're operating out of not too tight, not too loose, and out of not using a real strong right and wrong mentality is happening, then it's more like a dance. You'll find that that may be a time when you apologize. The one thing I could say over and above what I've just said is, if you apologize, do it once and don't necessarily look for a response, or it'll be let off the hook. Make it just your apology, rather than I apologize and I noticed they didn't say, oh, that's all right. They didn't say, oh, don't worry about it. Well, you know, it didn't hurt that much. I know you didn't mean it. All kinds of. It starts to get very fishy after a while. There's a lot of interchange around that. Follow me?
It sounds like you're saying, like, you giving your instructions, don't do it, don't add another.
Don't do anything unless you have to. I mean, if you need to apologize, like there's some kinds of apologies, like if you bump into somebody in the hallway and they have coffee and they spill coffee, of course oops, sorry, I didn't mean to, sorry I got in your way, I wasn't paying attention. So it was a simple situation. But sometimes they're a lot more complicated than that, and if you look at it really close, you can see you might not even think, but you'll just notice that you don't have a lot of energy going towards the apology part. And sometimes if you do, you'll notice that if you look at your intention or your motivation behind anything you do, especially that, you can see it's more about you than them. It's more about you wanting to be a person who apologizes, and you'll feel that when you get no response from them. Quarter two?
Almost.
Okay.
I have a question.
Yes, certainly.
I keep going back to the political scene that is rapidly changing here in this
Everybody
country.
does.
And so the whole idea of setting up standards, it feels like some of the standards that I thought were set up are being eradicated or altered. So
Yeah, it's
I guess the question is, how do we navigate what's happening in that?
it might sound like some kind of a passive kind of thing where we're not doing anything, but you need to find out who you are. Now, this has been going on for centuries and centuries. This is not new. If you go back, even in president, if you look at the presidents we've had, if you're talking about that situation, which I think you are, we've yet to have an enlightened sage in the White House. Yeah. And so all of them have a lot of confusion. The downside is the confusion. In this situation, the confusion is just more evident and it's more blustery. So, but we've had confusion all along. Just more manageable stuff. So your question is, what should you do?
Well, and it just feels like a helpless situation.
Yeah, it does.
And so how is sitting facing the wall, finding out who we are, helpful?
You're not separate from anything. It doesn't go very far when you're well, what about global warming? What about nuclear threats? What about all the politics? Yes, I watch the news every day, as you know. So, but it's about awareness. It's not about jumping on some particular bandwagon. And you'll have people, blaming you and setting up in power. There are some powerful standards out there. You should, and you're going to sit there and do that, and you're going to go and turn into a vegetable while the world's falling apart. And, very fishy. A person who would be talking that way does not know who they are. They don't know that they're not separate from anything, from the Buddha, from an oak tree down the street. They're not separate from a dog shit in the yard. To realize that, everything slows down. We've been doing this for, countless eons. Here we are again. So it's not just a little 200-year period of our wonderful country.
Thank you.
Okay, yes, sir, one last question.
So, from what it sounds like, or maybe my perception, is that
Yes.
it sounds like what is right and what is wrong is essentially putting our perception or our judgment on certain situations. So, does morality even exist then?
Well, it's it depends on how you look at it. It varies in different ways. So some people, Sharia law is pretty intense. We've looked into that at all. But also there's all kinds of other laws and rights and wrongs and everything. The basic thing is, as His Holiness Dalai Lama said, my religion is kindness. It's a big statement. So to actually, no matter who you run into, insofar as you can, to be kind. And quite often, if you do that, that will be mistrusted. People don't expect that. They want you to give them advice, or they want you to fight with them. They want if someone who's projecting an enemy. If you're not an enemy, if you don't manifest as an enemy, you might get killed anyway.
They'll make you one,
Yeah, they'll make you an enemy. They'll just kill you. And sometimes you're not doing anything is perceived as weakness. This is a projection. It's happening everywhere in our society right now. People are projecting on others that they're weak because they're not doing what they're doing. You're not doing you're not marching with the same drummer. It would be interesting if we had a really powerful leader come up and help us a little bit, like an enlightened sage. Probably unlikely. They're not very popular. Even Mahatma Gandhi was not popular. So, and he was very helpful to people. He was an interesting combination of a person who was a religious orientation but functioned politically. Unusual. Okay, very good. Thank you so much. Now we'll do daily Dharma gathering.
First, we'll dedicate the merit in the back of your books. Also, would like to remind everybody at this year end, please donate to SokukoJi, and either online, PayPal, or in our donation boxes in the back. And also would like to remind everybody that this Saturday, December 31st, is our all day, and it's New Year's Eve, so we'll just continue until midnight. May the merit of this penetrate into all places, so that we and every sentient being together can realize the Buddha's way. Ji ho san shi fu shi son bu sa mo ko sa mo the tender
directions, the three worlds, all Buddhas, all venerable ones, Bodhisattvas, Mahasattvas, the great Prajna, Paramita.
O Buddhas and Bodhisattvas of the 10 directions and the 3 times, please hear us. Please come down out of the light and protect SokukoJi Buddhist Temple Monastery, our Sangha, families, friends, and visitors. Heal everyone who is unhappy, sick, or suffering, and fill them with light.